Section 1. History often remembers Field Marshal Erwin Rommel as the Desert Fox, a master of mobility who seemingly defied the odds to dance circles around the British 8th Army. However, when we strip away the wartime propaganda reels and examine the Quartermaster General's ledgers, a starkly different reality emerges. The North African campaign was not decided by tank aces or flanking maneuvers. It was decided by the unforgiving mathematics of fluid dynamics and distance. This theater serves as the ultimate case study in how the seduction of tactical speed can tragically blind a commander to the hard limits of logistical physics. Now, let's open the archives and dissect the system that decided the outcome. The central paradox of the North African theater lies in the relationship between operational success and logistical viability. In a standard European theater, an advancing army captures railheads, industrial centers, and population hubs that can be utilized to sustain momentum. In the North African desert, however, an advance captured only empty space. When we analyze the operational maps from 1941 and 1942, we see that every tactical victory Rommel achieved pushed his armored spearheads further away from his primary supply hub in Tripoli. This created an inverse relationship between tactical brilliance and strategic stability. The more battles the Panzer Army Afrika won, the closer it came to systemic collapse. To understand this, we must look at the concept of operational reach. This is the distance over which a military force can concentrate decisive power before it hits its culminating point, the moment where the strain of logistics exceeds the combat power of the unit. Rommel's doctrine of Bewegungskrieg, or maneuver warfare, was predicated on high-tempo aggression and rapid decision cycles. This approach requires a massive, uninterrupted flow of fuel and munitions to sustain the momentum. Yet, the archival data reveals that the infrastructure of North Africa was physically incapable of supporting such a tempo over the distances Rommel attempted to traverse. The geography itself acted as a flow restrictor. The primary logistical artery was the Via Balbia, a single paved coastal road that stretched across Libya and Egypt. There were no parallel rail networks of significant capacity to handle heavy freight. This meant that every liter of fuel, every artillery shell, and every replacement track link had to be moved by truck. When we review the tonnage requirements for a panzer division in 1942, approximately 300 to 350 tons of supplies per day during active combat, it becomes clear that Rommel's tactical ambitions were mathematically incompatible with his transport capacity. The myth of the Desert Fox suggests that Rommel was defeated by overwhelming Allied material superiority, a David versus Goliath narrative, where the nimble German force was crushed by British mass. While the British did eventually achieve material dominance, this narrative obscures the internal systemic failure of the Axis command. The archives show that Rommel frequently ignored the warnings of his own logisticians. Major General Alfred Gauss and Colonel Friedrich von Mellenthin repeatedly presented data indicating that the supply chain could not support an advance into Egypt. Rommel, favoring intuition over calculation, dismissed these logistical constraints as problems for the quartermasters to solve, rather than binding parameters for his strategy. This disconnect between the tactical commander and the logistical reality created a fragile system. Rommel operated on the assumption that he could capture British fuel stocks to supplement his own deficits, a strategy that amounts to systemic gambling. By relying on enemy resources to maintain operational tempo, the Panzer Army surrendered control of its own metabolic rate. They were not just fighting the British 8th Army, they were fighting the physics of their own supply chain. As the panzers pushed east toward El Alamein, they were not racing toward victory. They were racing away from their lifeline, stretching the elastic band of their logistical tail until it was physically guaranteed to snap. The failure was not that the supply trucks didn't arrive. It was that the system was designed in a way that made their arrival irrelevant against the consumption rates of the tactical plan. Section 2. To fully comprehend the collapse of the Axis forces in North Africa, we must move our gaze from the battlefield maps to the odometer readings of the supply columns. The strategic reality of the Desert War was defined by a concept logisticians call the tyranny of distance. As Rommel's forces pushed east across the Cyrenaican Bulge and into Egypt, they stretched their supply lines to breaking point. The distance from the primary port of Tripoli to the front lines at El Alamein is roughly 2,000 kilometers. To put this into a comparative perspective, this is roughly equivalent to supplying an army fighting in Moscow from a depot in Berlin, using a single two-lane road that is under constant aerial bombardment. When we conduct an autopsy of the German supply chain, we find a system suffering from a catastrophic drop in transport efficiency. In logistics, efficiency is measured by the ratio of payload delivered versus resources consumed to deliver it. In a healthy supply chain operating over short distances, such as the early Blitzkrieg campaigns in France, this cost is negligible. The trucks drive 100 kilometers, offload, and return. However, as the distance in North Africa compounded, the German logistical tail entered a consumption trap. The workhorse of the Wehrmacht, the Opel Blitz 3-ton truck, became the victim of this mathematical inevitability. Analytical reconstruction of the convoy data paints a grim picture. A standard supply column traveling from Tripoli to the front lines required immense quantities of fuel just to power its own engines. Archival estimates suggest that for every liter of fuel delivered to the panzer tanks at the operational limit near El Alamein, the transport chain consumed between 1 and 2 liters of fuel simply moving the cargo. This is a logistical death spiral. The supply column ceases to be a delivery mechanism and becomes a parasitic organism, consuming the majority of the energy it is tasked with transporting. The problem was exacerbated by the staging necessity. A truck cannot drive 2,000 kilometers on a single tank of gas. It must refuel. In a linear supply chain without forward refineries or railheads, the only source of fuel for the truck is the cargo it is carrying. We see reports of supply convoys arriving at forward depots, having depleted nearly half their payload. To mitigate this, the Wehrmacht had to establish intermediate dumps. But this only added friction to the system. A truck would drive to point B, offload fuel to refill a truck going to point C, and then return to point A. Each transfer point introduced delays, spillage, and evaporation, a significant factor in the desert heat where fuel stored in simple steel jerry cans could expand and leak, or simply evaporate at rates recorded as high as 30% during long-haul transit. Furthermore, we must analyze the composition of the logistical fleet itself. The Panzer Army Afrika did not possess a standardized, ruggedized fleet of desert transports. Instead, the quartermaster logs reveal a logistical zoo. The columns were a chaotic mix of German manufacturers, Italian trucks, which were actually often better designed for the terrain but lacked parts, and a massive percentage of captured British vehicles. While using captured trucks seems like a resourceful tactical improvisation, from a systems engineering perspective, it is a nightmare. Maintenance records show that maintaining this heterogeneous fleet required thousands of different spare parts, spark plugs, gaskets, axle rods that were simply not available. A captured Bedford truck might carry vital supplies for 500 kilometers, but the moment a specialized belt snapped, that truck and its cargo capacity was removed from the board entirely. The desert environment acted as a severe stress test. Sand ingestion destroyed engines at 5 times the European rate. Without a standardized supply chain for parts, the attrition rate of the transport fleet outpaced the replacement rate. The data indicates that by late 1942, the operational availability of the Axis transport fleet hovered dangerously low, often below 50%. This consumption trap created a distinct operational lag. Even when fuel tankers successfully docked in Tripoli or Benghazi, dodging the Royal Navy and RAF interdiction from Malta, it took days, sometimes weeks, for that fuel to physically traverse the distance to the front. This delay decoupled the strategic input from the tactical output. Rommel might receive a radio message that 5,000 tons of fuel had arrived in port, prompting him to plan an offensive. But due to the throughput limitations of the single coastal road and the parasitic consumption of the trucks, that fuel would arrive in a trickle, not a wave. The system was rigid. It lacked the surge capacity to rectify mistakes. When the RAF bombed a key bottleneck like the Halfaya Pass, the flow of supplies didn't just slow down, it stopped. The backlog would ripple backward all the way to Tripoli. We see this in the desperate cables sent from the front lines in October 1942, begging for fuel that existed in the theater but was geographically dislocated from the tanks that needed it. The logistics system was not an empty pipe. It was a clogged artery. The blood was there, but the heart, the transport capacity, was too weak to pump it to the extremities before the body collapsed. Section 3. Ultimately, the defeat of the Panzer Army Afrika was not merely a failure of transport capacity. It was a catastrophic failure of operational visibility. In modern supply chain management, we utilize a concept known as inventory visibility, the ability to know exactly what resources are available, where they are located, and when they will arrive. Rommel's command structure suffered from a fatal lack of this data fidelity. The reference to simple fuel gauges is not merely metaphorical. It represents the granular disconnect between the strategic planners and the tactical reality. The German High Command in Berlin and the Commando Supremo in Rome operated on theoretical tonnage charts, while the tank crews at the front operated on the terrifying reality of empty dipsticks. This informational asymmetry reached its crisis point during the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. When we analyze the operational logs from the days preceding the battle, we see a command system paralyzed by the fog of logistics. Rommel, returning from sick leave to take command, found his mobile defense strategy unworkable. His doctrine relied on the ability to shift his panzer divisions rapidly to counterattack British breakthroughs. However, without real-time data on fuel reserves, he could not calculate the range of motion for his armored fist. The archives reveal a desperate gambling of assets. Rommel was forced to disperse his armor behind the infantry lines rather than concentrating it, simply because he lacked the fuel to maneuver a concentrated force in response to a British thrust. This is where the system truly decided the outcome. General Montgomery, utilizing a methodical push-based logistics system, had built up a massive visible surplus. He could calculate his operations with mathematical certainty. Rommel, conversely, was trapped in a reactive cycle, dependent on the arrival of fuel tankers that, due to the transport attrition analyzed in the previous section, were statistically unlikely to arrive. When the battle commenced, the paralysis was total. Tactical opportunities for counterattacks appeared and vanished within hours, but the panzers could not exploit them. The decision-making loop was broken. A commander cannot order a flanking maneuver if he cannot guarantee the fuel to return. We see in the battle diaries that localized commanders were hoarding fuel, hiding reserves from the central authority to ensure their own unit's survival, further distorting the data available to Rommel. The system had lost its integrity. The Desert Fox was not outfought. He was immobilized. The operational brain could still conceive of brilliant maneuvers, but the metabolic system had ceased to function. The defeat was absolute because it was systemic. The operational plan required a level of logistical precision and visibility that the infrastructure simply did not possess. As the dust settles over the rusting hulks of the North African desert, the romantic myth of the Desert Fox fades, revealing the cold, hard architecture of the conflict. We are left with a profound truth. War is not merely a contest of will or tactical acumen, but a test of systems. The tragedy of the Panzer Army was not a lack of courage, but a fatal misunderstanding of the physics that govern movement. In the end, the ledger always balances, and the system that ignores the tyranny of distance will always, inevitably, run dry.